Dobrodošli u novu epizodu podkasta Novog Magazina Razumeti, čelično, prijateljstvo. Pre nego što najavim našu današnju gošću, pozvao bih vas sve da zapratite naše profile na društvenim mrežama. Dakle, Novi Magazin možete pronaći na YouTube-u, Novi Magazin YouTube kanal. Možete nas zapratiti na Instagramu, takođe na TikToku i na Facebooku. Danas sam imao zadovoljstvo da razgovaram sa Anom Krstinovskom. Ana je jedna sjajna istraživačica koja nam dolazi iz Severne Makedonije. Ona je predsednica i osnivačica organizacije koja se zove Estima i koja u svom fokusu ima istraživanje saradnje Kine sa državama Zapadnog Balkana, ali ono što je pogotovo važno napomenuti da je najveći deo tog istraživanja stavljen u kontekst pristupanja država Zapadnog Balkana Evropskoj uniji. Ovo je još jedan u nizu razgovora koji mi kroz ovu seriju podcasta želimo da započnemo kako bismo vam omogućili da malo bolje razumete šta se sve to dešava u kontekstu saradnje Srbije i Narodne Republike Kine. Sada smo malo proširili i malo smo više pričali o regionu. Dakle, gledajte nas na YouTube-u, zapratite nas na društvenim mrežama, možete nas takođe naći i na Spotify-u, i na Deezeru, i na drugim podcast platformama i naravno ovaj podcast ne bi bio moguć bez podrške ambasade Sjedinjenih Američkih Država u Srbiji. Anna, welcome to Novi Magazin podcast. Welcome to the Understanding the Still Friendship podcast. It's really nice to have you coming to us from North Macedonia. And I have to say that it is something that I was wanting to do since we started recording, because talking about the region of the Western Balkans and talking about the people that are dealing with the topic of Chinese presence in the Western Balkans, I could not imagine having more competent interlocutor than you. So thank you for being our guest today here in Belgrade.
Thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and to talk to you as usual.
So let's start from something that goes a little bit within the lines with what I'm asking all of the guests. So it's often being described, the partnership between Serbia and China as a still friendship. But having your perspective on that would be really interesting to hear. If you hear or read like that Sino-Serbian partnership is being described as a still friendship, what is your opinion on that? What is your perspective on that phrase?
Well, since I don't hear the phrase for the first time, it's difficult for me to dissociate it from the Smederevo steel mill. So obviously it was coined for that purpose. But now I see it more in the geopolitical sense, meaning that it's a bilateral relationship that can withstand all seasons, all types of weather, that it's endurable, solid, and can last. And we see that a lot with the recent geopolitical changes, with the war in Ukraine and with the global polarization between the East and the West. So we see that China has Serbia's back and Serbia has China's back when it comes to implementing sanctions against China, in the sense of aligning with the EU, or in other areas where Serbia is getting closer to China and where China is in a way rewarding Serbia for this friendship, for this steel friendship, by backing Serbia's position in the UN Security Council on Kosovo, by providing a lot of investments. So basically it's a friendship that can withstand the test of time.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that perspective, especially after the Belt and Road Summit in October of the last year, in October 2023, because we had pretty much the iteration of that phrase by Xi Jinping himself, stating that what is tying Serbia and China is ironclad friendship. So a little bit of variation on the theme, but still fully in line with what we are discussing today. But before we go to the regional and geopolitical topics, let's talk a little bit about you, about your work. So you have a history with China. You have a history with China that goes a little bit outside of the politics itself. So can you tell us a little bit about what are your connections with China and what are your connections with the topic of the Chinese presence in the Western Balkans region?
So my initial background is in the area of sinology. I studied Chinese language and literature at the university in Skopje. Then I got a scholarship from the Chinese government to go and spend a couple of years in Beijing to perfection, in a way, my language level. And since international relations and diplomacy and global politics has always been an interest of mine, once I went back to Skopje, I started to somehow shift more in the direction of international relations, and I did a master degree in European affairs, where I wrote my MA on the EU-China relations. So basically China has been present in a way throughout my whole career, even when I was focusing apparently on other stuff like EU integration. And then I started working for the government. So for 4 years I was working on international relations for the government, covering both the EU portfolio and covering partly China and its relations with Macedonia. And since 2017 I moved to civil society, where I do research. I wrote my my PhD dissertation on the topic of Chinese development assistance to the Western Balkans. And now what I do in the area of civil society is work on this triangle of relations between China, the EU and the Western Balkans. So basically China's presence in all the countries in the region and how it impacts the countries' prospects of joining the EU in near future.
Yeah, I would like maybe to go a little bit more in details on what you're focusing on currently. You are a president of the NGO or think tank and the founder of the think tank called Estima in North Macedonia, but really with the regional and maybe on the European level, if not wider presence. And we know each other for some time. We have met before discussing this topic, and we actually cooperate together on a project that is currently ongoing. So can you tell us a little bit more about your current focus, the work of Estima, and maybe a little bit of our joint project that you are currently engaged in?
Sure. Estima is a think tank that deals with the area of policy research and analysis, focusing particularly on foreign policy and on China's presence in the region. And last year, we launched an initiative called Western Balkans China Policy Team. So the objective of this initiative is to somehow contribute to better and more informed policies on China in all the countries in the region. Because in my experience until now, it is China that is driving the initiatives and the policies in the region. And the countries, whether we're talking about Serbia, Montenegro or Macedonia, they're simply accepting and taking what is on offer. Mm-hmm. But they do not have a lot of proactive attitude to ask for what they would like to have or to somehow modify or amend some initiatives that may be harmful for them. So basically the idea with this project is for these countries to create policies where they will have more benefits in their relationship with China and reduce the harmful effects, whether we're talking about environmental damage, undermining good governance in some Chinese funded projects. So we're trying basically to have better, more coordinated, more focused and more comprehensive China policies in these countries.
So talking about the policy implementation in the region, we can probably agree that it has been more challenging to have these discussions in some countries than others. And it goes fully in line with something that we can describe as a differentiated regional approach or let's say the level of success that Chinese presence had in the region. Do you see some clear cuts or some divisions between the regional level approach or maybe the countries from the region acceptance level to the Chinese presence?
We have to mention that China's offer to the countries in the region was initially the same because it started 10 years ago with the China cooperation platform with the Central and Eastern European countries. So that was the period when China was somehow testing the grounds. So the offer was the same. Funding for infrastructure projects, increased trade, some investments. And then throughout the years, and especially in the past 5 or 6 years, we are seeing an obvious gap in terms of the Chinese presence in Serbia and the rest of the countries. It is related to a certain extent to the global polarization because 3 of those countries, namely North Macedonia, Albania and Montenegro, became NATO members. So for them, cooperation with China in some areas like high politics or the area of defense and military is out of the question. Also in some critical areas that are considered sensitive, like telecommunications or energy, it's also a bit difficult to cooperate with China. And at the same time, we see that Serbia is running with full steam and implementing new projects with China. Bosnia, to a certain extent, is trying to emulate what Serbia is doing, but because basically the situation is quite different. Bosnia is a very complicated country in terms of political, administrative divisions, in terms of stability, political stability, rule of law. So the Chinese are somehow discouraged to do business there, and that is leaving us with Serbia as their preferred destination. And we see that across the board. If we compare Serbia to the rest of the countries, it has 10 times more Chinese direct investments than all the other countries. Basically, in Serbia, 20% of the total FDI is Chinese investments. In countries like Macedonia or Albania, that percentage is 2% or less, and is declining. We are seeing, for instance, in Albania, where there were a couple of big Chinese investments, Chinese investors are somehow becoming less welcome. Mm-hmm. There was a concession of the Tirana International Airport that was owned by a Hong Kong company, and they were in a way obliged to sell it to a local Albanian company and just divest and move out. And this has been also the case for some smaller investments in the area of chromium mining, etc. And we don't see any new investments coming in these countries from China. So, and to compare, in Serbia we have greenfield investments, we have these major acquisitions by Chinese companies, which obviously contributes to a big difference in terms of presence and influence. So when we are talking about Chinese influence in the Western Balkans, we have to differentiate that Serbia and the rest of the countries is basically not the same case.
Yeah, I understand the point, and I would say that like we are witnessing some of the, let's say, maybe changes even recently. We have had a statement from Albanian Prime Minister who said that one of the reasons why Albania is not really pursuing any higher level of partnership with China is that China brought nothing to Albania. I mean, recently that the mentioned China CEC platform of cooperation didn't really resulted in specific projects in Albania. But we cannot neglect the fact that Albania, for example, or even Macedonia in certain cases, although you should benefit from like having a more stable governments in the recent history, have showed a little bit more dedication, for example, to the European integration process. It is yet to be seen, the verdict is yet to be, given to the Montenegro, because they had their ups and serious downs when it comes to the level of the Chinese presence. But definitely with them being the NATO member country, in those specific areas that you have mentioned, it is not really to be expected that there will be a new momentum in developing of cooperation with China. But Serbia then, as like a poster child, is a country that has like proclaimed military neutrality, which means that we will probably never, or like not in perceivable future, be part of NATO alliance. But we still have that European membership foreign policy goal as at least proclaimed foreign policy goal. What I'm getting to, and what I actually want to ask you, after the outburst of the Russian aggression in 2022 in Ukraine, we have seen the new momentum in the European integration. Do you see European integration as another, let's say, burden to the development of the relationship with China within the regional countries? Or maybe to reformulate that, whether the countries will be bring themselves in a position that they have to choose either the EU membership and the facilitation of the EU integration process, or development of cooperation with China?
Well, in principle, they should not be first and foremost put in a situation to choose. because all of the EU countries have a relationship with China. Some of them have a much more intensive cooperation with China in the area of investments and trade compared to the Western Balkan countries. So China basically is not against the region's EU integration for a very simple reason. It is in Chinese interest for these countries to gradually become members of the EU. That means that Chinese companies that are already established in these countries will have easier access to the EU single market because these countries are on that path. They are gradually joining the European single market. And it will also mean that at some point, when these countries join the European Union, China will have its allies at the table in the European Union, at the Council of Ministers, when foreign policy decisions are being made. So imagine with Serbia having this still friendship with China, it will be even more difficult for the EU to adopt a unanimity to, for instance, to introduce sanctions against China. So basically it will be in Chinese interest to have these countries in the EU for strategic reasons, geopolitical reasons, economic reasons. What the issue is that some of the governments in these countries now, but also in the past, and not only in Serbia, but also in Macedonia and in Montenegro, were inclined to somehow put aside the principles of EU integration in order to please the Chinese companies, investors, the Chinese government. So, for instance, when we were taking up loans, we were not considering the EU threshold of 60% of debt ratio. Mm-hmm. So we took huge loans to be able to build highways both in Macedonia and in Montenegro. And those decisions were made completely against the EU rules, not only against the EU rules, but also against the national rules without public procurements. There were allegations of corruption, there were allegations of environmental damage, especially in Montenegro. So basically, I don't see that China is the only one undermining these countries' EU accession process, but China is working together with some of the corrupt political elites to somehow maximize its interests in the region. And that's the main problem.
Yeah, I think that we had like this discussion before, like there is a clear differentiation between, for example, Russia and China and their presence in the region. Like Russia is obviously a spoiler actor. Like it is in the Russian interest to spoil the processes, literally to directly or indirectly through their partners and their outposts here in the region, harm the process of European integration, even the NATO membership process for some countries in the past, while China is pretty much facilitating the already existing processes. So if you have like a government in any of the countries willing, to disregard the environmental standards or to disregard the rules for competition and market orientation, China will not, defy it. Like China will step in, or the Chinese companies, Chinese government, through the preferential loan agreements will step in, and they will not maybe make you to do it, but they will be more than happy to facilitate the process that you have already started. And that actually brings me to the conclusion that you might agree with, but I would like to hear your opinion, whether some of the countries, or let's put it like directly, whether Serbia, for example, it's harming its EU perspective, not because it is cooperating with China, but because it's allowing itself to disregard all of those aspects in order to establish the context in which cooperation with China and Chinese companies is possible.
Yes, I think that it is harming its prospects, to put it very, very bluntly. But then again, it looks like Serbia, given the Kosovo issue, is not counting on joining the EU anytime soon. And that is why it signed the FTA with China. And that is why it is only focused on the short-term gains in the cooperation with China. So investments that will bring on a timeline of 3 to 5 years returns that will contribute to exports, that will contribute to new employment opportunities. And then we see that China has a rather opportunistic attitude, so it is cooperating on all these aspects with Serbia. So yes, basically Serbia is undermining its EU integration prospects, but this is in a way a reversible process because it can also align at some point with the EU legislation. It can implement its own national legislation more firmly and more consistently. So I don't see a big problem if there is a clear and demonstrated willingness on the side of the government to move in the EU integration process.
I tend to have a similar position on that. I am repeating that, but that's because we have had these discussions before. It is not that we are not expecting good things from the cooperation with China, or that we are not seeing good things coming from cooperation with China. It's just what we are putting as a leverage against it. If we want the new highways and we get the new highways, it's really good thing that we get that. Like, I really love that I can get from Belgrade to the mountain of Zlatibor now in 3 hours instead of 5 hours. That's a really good thing. It's just that we have a right to ask why that partner was chosen or what was the price of it, whether it could have been like a less expensive project or like maybe that was really the best offer. It is those small or not such a small things that are burdening that type of cooperation that are making China watchers asking those type of questions, and all that we want is like those questions being answered.
Well, it's perfectly legitimate. Yeah. We live in democratic societies, or at least our political leaders claim that our societies are democratic, so they need to prove that. Let me just share with you briefly the example of the Macedonian highways that were built with Chinese funds. And I also fully agree it's very good to have the highways. The thing is that the highway was contracted 10 years ago, so in 2013. Now it's 2024 and the highway, 50-kilometer stretch, is not being finished yet. Oh. And the price is going up. We sign annexes that increase the price. The last one was for 200 million euros. So the cost of the highways is going up. The highway is nowhere to be built. And then a couple of weeks ago, our Prime Minister had a statement saying that there were 11 landslides on the built stretch of the highway that now need to be cleared, and they should ensure the safety that these landslides will not occur. So that will probably further raise the price. And now we are asking ourselves, why? I mean, why didn't the Chinese side or the Macedonian government pay more attention in the planning of the highway? Why didn't they make good geological examinations, do a proper project documentation? And then also the questions that you raised about the tendering. Why go with that specific Chinese company and not find the best cost-benefit ratio? And all of these questions are very legitimate, and they are countering the myth that Chinese projects are implemented cheaper or more quickly, because yes, you start building highway in our case more quickly, but then you spend even more money repairing the mistakes that should have been addressed in the project planning phase before you start building. And that is usually the comparison between the EU funds. We say that EU funds are too bureaucratic, that they come too slowly, that the planning phase takes too long. But then if you consider the planning phase and the implementation phase when it comes to EU-funded projects, altogether is shorter than the planning and implementation phase of the Chinese-funded projects. That, at least in our case, that's the case in Montenegro. And I'm sure that in Serbia there are also a couple of examples that have this flaws.
Yeah, Serbia is actually a really decent opportunity to examine how the things are being done in a country that is not part of the European Union, and the countries that are, let's say, more devoted to the European integration or are already part of the European Union. We have that Belgrade-Budapest railroad, while because everything needed to be, clear and precise on Hungarian case, because they have the overwatch of the European Commission in the end, In Serbia, we have pretty much just started building it. We will get to the Hungarian border probably in the next year or so. And it is yet to be seen whether, for example, those trains and railroads will be compatible to the European system of railways, or whether some of the habitats that have been, let's say, on the map will be endangered, because we had a local activist mentioning the long-term effects to some of the natural habitats down the stretch of that railway. But on another note, and this is something that you have been focusing on, what has Serbia also been doing recently, or maybe for the past decade or so, is that we are calmly allowing not only Chinese, but also Chinese increased presence in strategically important areas. One of the most important areas that we can probably agree on are the natural resources that country has, like how you're exploiting it, who are you selling it to, what are your strategic orientations. And you, with one of your co-authors, wrote a piece on the Chinese presence in the industries that are based on the raw materials in the Western Balkans. And for me, it's one of the best overviews on how China is, presenting itself strategically throughout the region. Do you see China being present in those strategically important areas only in Serbia, or is that the case in other countries throughout the region as well?
I mentioned earlier that initially China's offer and Chinese approach was the same towards all the countries. And we are seeing what you're mentioning, China's interest for raw materials and extractive products throughout the region. In Serbia, it is most of the time copper that China is exploiting, exporting to China in a way to satiate its own hunger for raw materials, but also exporting to other countries. In the case of Albania, Chinese investors have a monopoly of oil exploitation, but also copper and chromium mines. In the case of North Macedonia, our most exported product is ferroalloys, and in the case of Montenegro, it's bauxite and aluminium ores. So if we see there is a pattern, most of these countries, with the exception of Bosnia, these 4 countries, exports to China consist of extractive products and raw materials. So basically these are products that do not have a big added value, but they contribute a lot to environmental degradation, especially if they are overexploited, as is the case in Serbia's Zijin mining with the copper. And we often read that the trade exchange between the Western Balkans and China has been on the rise in the past 10 years. But then we need to ask ourselves, is that in our interest, or does that bring along some negative consequences? Because we are exporting products that do not bring a lot of value to our economies, to our local communities, and what we are importing is goods with very high value added, which makes our trade deficit rise to the sky. But also leaves our economies in a situation where they cannot develop and where they cannot maximize the cooperation with China.
I was listening to a couple of your last sentences, and another topic from the Serbian case pops to mind, because there are other strategically important areas in Serbia where similar decisions are yet to be made. But let's put that for some other time, and leave that for some other time and some other discussion. But I would say that point that you have made are very well, can be very well adjusted to the similar scenario. And I think that we are slowly getting to the end of our conversation, but there is another thing that I would like to ask you, to put you a little bit on the spot and to ask of you to be a prophet a little bit. How do you perceive Chinese presence and its development in the region down the road? Do you see countries getting maybe a little bit closer to the European Union and then distancing itself a little bit from the level of cooperation with China? Or do you see maybe it as a business as usual, and then depending on the other aspects of geopolitical developments and maybe internal politics throughout the region and in individual countries that are pursuing or not pursuing cooperation with China?
Well, if we put Serbia aside, the other 3 countries that are NATO members in the region are already pretty much aligned with the EU requirements when it comes to their cooperation with China. So they are not cooperating in any strategic areas. I would say that the cooperation is rather symbolic. It is only in the case of Serbia that there is a very burgeoning cooperation, and to a certain extent in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But we have to understand that China is in the region for a long game. So China does not plan on a 5 to 10 year horizon, but plans to stay here. And I don't think that China has any issues in waiting for a good opportunity to have some investment in the region, to implement a new project. And what we are also seeing in these countries that have somehow become less welcome in China is a change in China's approach, because obviously the governments are pretty much pro-Western, not only pro-EU, but also pro-US, and they do not want to have a big cooperation with China. But China is shifting its approach to work more with the societies, with those parts of the society that are not very dependent on the governments. So we see China's increased efforts to penetrate academia, higher education institutions, also the media environment. It works a lot with the business chambers, because the business community will always be for a good relationship with China. We see that throughout the world. So basically China is not wasting time, is not idling, but is rather adapting. And I think that we are going to see increasingly this adapting approach. For instance, if in some areas Chinese investors are not welcome, they will seek to join forces with Western investors. We already saw that in Montenegro with the Može wind park. We see that in North Macedonia. There is one joint venture between a Chinese and an American company.
Same in Serbia regarding the windmill farms, as well.
So we see that China is finding a way to make itself more welcome in the region. And we should not underestimate China's learning curve. So China has a very big ability to learn. It has a lot of resources. It's a huge country with a lot of resources devoted to foreign policy. So I think that we are going to see a different approach of China in the Western Balkans, but we are not going to see less of a presence.
I think it's a really good note to finish on, but before we go, I would like to thank you once again for dedicating your time, for finding us here in Belgrade, and I would, if anyone is interested in following more of your work, please find Estima's social media profiles. You will see some neat videos from Western Balkans China policy team, yours truly among them. And I think that things that you're focusing on and working on down the road will bring more clarity to the development of Western Balkans-China relationship, especially in the context of the European integration. So thank you for being so devoted and doing the hard work, and thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you for your kind words and for the invitation. It was truly a pleasure.